Tanks. They're cool, right? Massive beasts of iron and steel that rumble through the battlefield. But they have not always been the modern machines that they are today. Way back in World War I, they were little more than tractors with sheet metal welded on and a rifle stuck through a hole in the armor. They braved a hail of bullets while crossing no man's land, and would often get stuck. The British, who were the only ones with tanks at the time, and weren't quite willing to let them and their crews who knew how to operate them fall into German hands, would often shell the trapped tanks with their crews still inside. However, before we get to that part, we've got to lay some ground rules on what a tank actually is, really. So, without further ado, let us begin. Now, before we get into the meat of this video, talking about the history of tanks, how they're used in warfare, and how they affect other aspects of warfare, we must lay a few ground rules. First off, what actually constitutes as a tank? Now, to be clear, I am not talking about a fish tank. I am not talking about some player characters in video games that are meant to take a ton of damage for their team. Those are typically called tanks. No, I am talking about an armored vehicle used in warfare. Now, some people will describe a tank as an armored vehicle with a gun. But considering that every material has some form of armor usability, or usability as armor, by that definition, a car with a Glock strapped to the door could be considered a tank, which it obviously is not. So, what most people tend to describe a tank as is a tracked armored fighting vehicle with a cannon, used to support other elements of an army, such as infantry. Now, of course, there are always exceptions to a rule. There's exceptions to everything. And we're going to be going over those exceptions real quick. Now, first off, the M2 light tank. This tank does not have a cannon. It is fitted with two 50 caliber heavy machine guns. This is because at the time when it was fielded, tank's armor was so thin they didn't actually need a cannon to go through it, they only needed a couple of heavy machine guns. So, to save cost, weight, time, space, ammunition, and all that other fun stuff, they decided to go with just a couple heavy machine guns and call it a day. So, that is a tank, technically. But if you go a bit further into the future, and you look at something like, say, the M109 Paladin, that is not a tank. That is a self-propelled artillery piece, purely because it does not have a cannon. It has a 155mm howitzer. It is used as artillery. Going a bit smaller, we have things like the Russian BMP and the American M2 Bradley. Those are IFVs, or infantry fighting vehicles. Those are called IFVs because they can carry troops. And, of course, there are always exceptions to this rule, the key one in this case being the Israeli Merkava main battle tank. It can carry troops, but is still considered a tank. Why? I do not know. I'm sorry about that, but naming systems are weird, okay? Now, the last thing that we will not be considering a tank is tanks armed with only missiles, or with missiles as their primary armament. Things like the Russian IT-1, or the American LOSAT. Granted, most of these vehicles are experimental, but in the case that some of them were used in actual warfare, we will not be considering them tanks. Now, the two things we will be considering as tanks are your conventional idea of a tank. Things like a King Tiger, a Sherman, a T-34, an Abrams, that sort of thing, right? And the other thing are things known as tank destroyers. Now, I get it. It's a little unconventional, but purely because the naming and designation systems vary so widely between countries on this, it just doesn't make sense to try to differentiate between the two of them and try to keep the video under a reasonable time limit. I simply cannot do that. So for the purposes of this video, the M10 Wolverine, the Stug 3, the ISU 152, and other tank destroyers like that are going to be considered tanks. Now, about those funky Italian things, sorry, but they have wheels. Now, we must go over the different components of a tank. Your typical tank is split up into two separate pieces: the main body of the tank, also known as the hull, and the turret. Now, sometimes the turret can be replaced with a few different things. For example, it may be replaced with a casemated turret, which is just your standard turret, except it is so much more armored, but it cannot turn. And it could also be replaced with a couple side sponsons, which are just bulges on the side of the hull where they house the guns. Both of these methods are very ineffective ways of housing a gun in a tank, so they're not used at all in the modern day. Now, the hull is also split into two separate pieces: the engine compartment, which houses the power plant and all its required systems and mechanics and all that stuff, and the fighting compartment. The fighting compartment houses literally everything else in a tank. It houses ammunition, radio equipment, weapon systems, the weapons themselves, and most importantly, the crew. Now, tank crews and their roles and responsibilities have changed over the past century or so that tanks have been in service. They started out with 8 guys to a tank in some of the first tanks, the land ships of the First World War. They had a driver, a commander, 2 gunners, and 2 loaders because they decided that they needed side sponsons instead of a turret for no particular reason. And they also had 2 gearsmen because the earliest tanks did not have an actual transmission that the driver could use. So they had to get 2 extra guys just to change gears. Then, in World War II, they shaved down a few unnecessary crew positions, specifically the gearsmen, and they added a new position, the assistant driver. Now, the assistant driver would help the driver drive, but they also mounted a bow machine gun in the front of the hull, and the assistant driver would operate that, as well as operate the radio. So they kept the driver, gunner, loader, commander, and they added the assistant driver for World War II tanks. Now, in the modern day, we got rid of the assistant driver. So we're down to 4 now. The driver, nowadays, is not only tasked with making sure that he can drive the tank in an actual combat situation, but also making sure that the engine is in good working order and not needing any repairs. If it needs repairs, he's the guy that puts in the orders for repairs, or at least puts the request for orders for repairs. He also has to make sure the engine is fueled and ready to go. The loader is not only tasked with loading the gun, but also has to fill the tank with ammunition and help the gunner in maintaining the weapon systems, which the gunner also has to operate the weapon systems, specifically the main gun and the coaxial machine gun. Now, the commander probably has the hardest jobs of them all. First off, actually commanding the tank. Coordinating a group of 3 guys to work as a highly functional unit is incredibly difficult. Plus, he also has to spot other targets so that his gunner can target them, and so that his crew isn't rendered blind, because tanks are very hard to see out of. He not only has to work the radio now because they got rid of the assistant driver, but he also has to learn what the mission is and communicate that effectively to his crew. Now, while we're on the subject of crew, I have a question for you. What is the most important part of a tank? Is it the engine, perhaps? Could it possibly be the cannon? Well, it's the crew. Because you can replace a tank, you cannot replace a human. Their families cannot replace them. So, you've got to protect them. But how do you protect them? Well, to do that, there are 4 main kinds of armor, with 2 extra kinds of armor that can be used to supplement existing armor. However, before we go into the specifics of those armors and how they are constructed, we first must understand the difference between strength and toughness. You see, strength is a material's ability to resist bending. Meanwhile, toughness is a material's ability to resist breaking after being bent. And these two kind of act in a trade-off sort of way. Some pretty good examples for the extremes of these would be glass and gold. You see, glass is incredibly strong, but not very tough. That makes it incredibly brittle, meaning when you hit it, it's going to shatter. But gold is very, very tough, but not quite so strong, so you can bend it a lot, but you can't really break it a lot. So, now that we know the difference between strength and toughness, we must now learn the methods in which strength and toughness were manipulated during the construction process of some of these tanks. Now, the main way of manipulating this was utilizing a method known as heat treating. Heat treating is where you take a chunk of steel, heat it up to about red hot, and then dunk it in water or oil. Now, when this happens, this increases the strength dramatically, but it does reduce the toughness a bit. This was a very delicate process because if you didn't heat it up enough, then when hit by a shell, the armor wouldn't have enough strength to hold up to it and would crumple like an aluminum can. But if you heat it up too high of a temperature, then the armor's too strong and not tough enough, and it'll shatter like glass when hit by a shell. So the actual construction workers building the tank had to keep this in mind when heat treating the armor for it. And pretty much all the components, actually. Everything needed to be strong enough to actually withstand prolonged use. Even things like the transmission and the engine, which weren't intended to be used as armor, had to be heat treated. So, now that we finally know how strength and toughness affect armor as a whole, we can finally start learning about the 4 main kinds of armor. The first of which being riveted armor. Now, riveted armor was the earliest kind of armor and was the first armor to be used on tanks. Now, riveted armor was created by taking a couple steel plates and then bolting them together with rivets. Now, riveted armor was also the easiest armor to make, not requiring a particularly skilled craftsman that wasn't super niche. So the guys that actually knew how to make riveted armor were pretty common compared to guys who knew how to make the other kinds of armor. But it was also the least effective kind of armor. You see, rivets were very good at holding things together until they vibrated. Well, when armor gets hit with a shell, you want to know what vibrates a lot? That's right, it's the armor. So when the shell hits the armor, it pops off a ton of the rivets, and they go flying around on the inside of the tank like bullets, injuring or in some cases even killing crew, even if there is no actual damage done to the steel plate. It is because of these issues that riveted armor has so far been the only main kind of armor to have been phased out of existence. It is gone. It is smited from the designer's table. So, next up is cast armor. Now, cast armor is created by taking a mold and pouring molten metal into it. That's it. It's very quick, very simple. However, because it's pouring molten metal into a mold, it meant that it wasn't very easy to get sharp corners on the armor. And instead, most tanks that are cast resulted with having rounded corners for their armor. Now, this is bad because a common tactic that tankers like to do is something called angling their tank. Now, when you angle your tank, it is pretty much you turn your tank's armor so that it's showing a angle to the incoming shell. Now, this increases the chance of ricochet, meaning the shell just bounces off, but even if it doesn't ricochet, it also means that the shell has to go through more armor to get inside the tank. But if you have a rounded corner, guess what? You can't armor a circle. The shell's just going to go straight through that angled corner like nothing because it's not angled. So that was a really big issue with cast armor. That and the fact that workers had to work with literal molten metal to make it, resulting in less than safe working conditions, but then again, they're working with tanks. When are the working conditions ever safe? So, cast armor has been phased out a little bit, but it is still in use today, most commonly seen with most T-72 series, T-80 series, and the earliest version of the T-90. I'm not saying that that's a good option, because that'd be flat wrong. It's a horrible choice to make, but I can kind of see what the Russians are doing with this, wanting to have super cheap tanks, and cast armor is pretty cheap. So, now we have finally arrived at the third main kind of armor, that being welded armor. Now, welded armor was made pretty much the exact same way as riveted armor. It's just, instead of bolting the steel plates together, they welded them together. And this allowed for thicker plates and to not have bolts that could fly around the inside of the tank when it's hit. This did, however, come with a pretty significant drawback. The countries that manufactured tanks with welded armor had to supply the factories with skilled workers and good enough materials to actually create quality welds. There were several issues and incidents where a tank got hit with a high explosive shell, specifically a King Tiger from late World War II, and the frontal plate just fell off. It's not like it exploded, it's not like it crumpled like a tin can because it wasn't properly heat treated. No, it just fell off because all the welds broke. So, that was an issue, but as long as you had a good production line, it wasn't that big of an issue. And that is why welded armor is still used today, specifically on the T-90A. Granted, it's not good compared to literally everything else we have, but it's still used. Yeah, that's great. Welded armor was doing just fine. But the guns got better too. Now, anti-tank guns that were conceived alongside of tanks were not really that much to look at. I mean, most of them were just a bigger rifle, and they were really heavy, hard to lug around for your standard infantrymen, and you may ask, well, they had artillery. Weren't they used as anti-tank guns? Yeah. I'll get to them in a moment, but they weren't really good at anti-tank guns. Don't get me wrong, sometimes they absolutely wrecked house, but that wasn't their intended purpose, really. They were good at it when they had the right conditions, but that was few and far between. So, going back to actual anti-tank guns designed to be anti-tank guns, your standard anti-tank gun at the time, by this time being World War I, was just a bigger rifle. And it did the job. It didn't even need to penetrate a tank's armor. All they really needed to do was hit it hard enough so that it would spall. Spalling is just where the back or the inside of the armor fractures and flies off on the inside of shrapnel. So, I mean, you don't even need to penetrate a tank to kill it, really. So, I mean, that was good for them, but, well, tank's armor got thicker, and then guns got bigger, and then tank's armor increased again, and then guns got bigger again, and I have described every single arms race, ever. So, I mean, there was a point where they started switching to actual shells instead of just big bullet. So, how did they penetrate tank's armor with these shells? Well, there are two main kinds of armor-piercing shells. Now, the first kind of armor-piercing shell is known as a kinetic energy weapon. Now, a kinetic energy weapon sounds a lot more complicated than it really is. It's like a hunk of steel that they shoot at the enemy. That's it. It's just a brick. So, very simple, but it gets the job done. However, you know what I was talking about earlier with angled armor and ricochets and all that funky stuff? Well, tank designers don't particularly like it when their shells bounce off enemies' tanks. So, they put a cap on it. Literally, it's just a cap. It's a soft cap that they put over the tip of the shell, and when it hits angled armor, it deforms so that it turns the shell so that it's actually facing the armor dead on, in a process known as normalizing. And then the shell can just penetrate straight through. Great. It fixed the issue for the most part. I mean, it didn't completely, entirely normalize the shell. I mean, that'd be impossible, but it helped a lot. But it kind of screwed with the aerodynamics a bit because it's very flat. So they put an even thinner ballistic cap on the front to fix the aerodynamics issue. However, on some tanks, the interior is so big that even with all the shrapnel and spalling coming from the actual penetration of the tank, nothing actually gets damaged, which is the whole reason why you penetrate a tank's armor, to damage things. So, what did they do? Well, they took some explosive and put it inside the shell in as a bursting charge. And they put a fuse at the front, and they fused it so that it would detonate immediately after penetrating a tank's armor. And this became known as armor-piercing, high-explosive, capped ballistic capped, or APHECBC. So, that's a mouthful. Don't worry. There are far more specialized shells that have like 20 letters in their acronyms, I swear. But yeah, I mean, that's kinetic energy weapons. They're pretty decent, but what's the other one? Well, the second kind of armor-piercing shell is known as a chemical armor-piercing shell. Now, I don't mean that they use, like, mustard gas to pierce enemy armor. That's not how that works. But it is slightly more sophisticated than throwing a brick at the enemy. So, what do? Well, they take a shell, and they put a big fuse on one end. Then they put some metal that has a very low melting point and is pretty soft. Something like copper is used in most cases. And then they have a shaped charge in the back. Well, how does this help penetrate armor? Well, that's the fun bit. You see, the shell is flung at the enemy tank, of course, and it still uses kinetic energy to punch through the armor. It just gets it in a different way. See, the shaped charge detonates when the fuse hits the enemy armor, and that instantly liquefies the metal, turning it into a jet of molten metal, and that jet of molten metal punches through the enemy armor. And that's how it gets in the tank. Yeah, that's a way of doing things, I guess. And because it's explosive, it's known as high explosive anti-tank, or HEAT. And nowadays, most tanks use heat in place of their standard high explosive shell, because heat can still be used against tanks, even though it has far less post-penetration damage compared to a standard armor-piercing shell. Because it doesn't create a lot of spalling, and it's only a jet of molten metal that's actually going inside the tank. Don't get me wrong, if someone inside the tank gets hit by that, they're gonna get cut in half, but how likely is a tank gunner going to be able to hit a specific guy inside a tank? Not very likely. So, yeah, those are the shells. And if heat is so great at penetrating a bunch of armor, how did they counter that? Well, that's where the last bits of armor come in. Now, the last main kind of armor is used the most frequently to this day, and that is composite armor. I know, it sounds a little funky, like every other armor has been using just metal, and then you have this one that's called composite. Now, it doesn't get that name for nothing. It's a composite of a bunch of different materials. Now, the fact that it's still used today means a lot of it is highly classified, and I don't exactly know how that works. If anyone wants to try to let me know, that'd be great, because I wasn't able to find any good sources on that. But, yeah, I heard some tanks, especially the M1A1 Heavy Common, which is the Marine Corps variant of the Abrams, they had, like, depleted uranium inserts on the turret face. I heard something on the War Thunder forums about some versions of the M1A2 having depleted uranium hull armor, and plus the various composites on the inside. I know some Leopard tanks, specifically the Leopard 2A7, has like a Kevlar spall liner that's just like a curtain behind the actual armor that's supposed to stop spall and catch it before it impacts any of the crew, which is nice. And I do know that the Russians are working with less new equipment. They've got like an old steel and quartz composite for their tank hulls because they don't have composite armor for the earlier turrets on their T-72s. That could have been changed, though. Either way, it's really old and only halfway decent against modern-day heat shells and just absolute trash against actual kinetic energy weapons. But, hey, I also mentioned the other two additives for the armor. What are those? Well, the first one is something known as spaced armor. Now, spaced armor is literally just a thin plate that is held away from the main body of armor. This is to detonate shells prematurely. And, yeah. And a heat shell loses a lot of its kinetic force very quickly after it detonates, because it's a jet of molten copper. It's a big punch at first, but then it just doesn't have the capability to continue on, like a kinetic energy shell does. Now, the other armor is a little bit more explodey. And by a little bit, I mean a lot. It is explosive reactive armor, or ERA. Pretty much what it is it's a little box. You stick it on the armor, and it's got explosives on the inside and a thick metal plate on the outside. And when a heat shell comes in, it detonates, it sends the jet of molten metal into it, detonates the explosives fling the thick metal plate away, and coincidentally also fling the heat shell away, and that makes it so that the actual molten metal doesn't have enough penetration to actually get into the armor. Now, granted, I think I saw a picture somewhere. I'll see if I can find it and put it up on here. I think I saw a picture of this somewhere where the Russians had a BMP with ERA on it, And this is a bad idea, purely because the BMP has far too thin armor for this. Even if, when the ERA detonated, the explosive somehow didn't manage to blow a gaping hole in the side of it, because they quite easily could, they are, at the end of the day, still explosives that you're putting on the side of your tank. But even then, the ERA only does so much. Even if they didn't manage to blow a hole in it, the remaining copper could, or molten metal or whatever it was being, the heat shield was used, well, that could easily just go right through the BMP anyway. So, some of these are a little case specific. I mean, I know the Bradley's got thicker armor, so it's alright to have ERA on that. And standard tanks, of course. I mean, they're tanks. They're made to take fire. So, those are all the different kinds of armors and shells, and I probably spent far too long talking about this. I'm dreading editing this. So, yeah, time to get into history. So, now we can finally start looking at the history of tanks, and not just talking about their specifications for all of eternity. Now, where can we start? Well, let's start at the beginning. The First World War, the Great War, the war to end all wars. Spoiler alert, it did not end all war. Now, World War I lasted about 4 years and wound up killing 15 to 20 million people, half of them civilians. Overall, pretty horrible war. Now, tanks were useful in this, or at least they were perceived to be. Because World War I was trench warfare. It was guys in a ditch versus guys in another ditch, about 100 feet away. So, I can see how tanks, big steel boxes, could provide cover for advancing forces. Well, how did they come to that conclusion? Well, the Army didn't. The British Royal Navy actually made the first push into actual tanks. You see, the first Sea Lord of the Admiralty, a man by the name of Winston Churchill, don't worry, he'll get more famous in a moment, decided to create something known as the Landship Committee. The Landship Committee wound up creating the Little Willie. Now, Little Willie was the first landship. It was very small and did not have a cannon. Make of that what you will. Now, Little Willie did not work very well. Broke down all the time, couldn't cross trenches really well, but it proved that tanks had a chance. So, they made a new design, called it the Mark I Landship, and made 150 of them. Problem, they only had 156-pounder cannons, which is what the Mark I was intended to use. Well, you may say, 150 equals 150. I mean, this is just working out fine. What's the issue? The issue is that the Mark I used 2 cannons. So, what they wound up doing was making a male version, which had the cannons, and a female version, which only had machine guns. And the female versions also tended to be a bit more specialized. There were versions of the female version that had a big mast on it that they could stop and actually put up, and that way they could actually use a radio. All other versions of the Mark I, and, well, all other versions of the Landship in general, just didn't have a radio unless it was the one that had the big mast on it. They used carrier pigeons. So, how were they first used? Well, they were shipped off to the Battle of the Somme. Now, Battle of the Somme was definitely a battle. I'm not going to say it was a good one because no battle is truly good. Pretty much the British plan was take a bunch of artillery, shell the German line for a few weeks, and then our boys can just saunter right up on there. Scotland lost a fifth of its army, and in total 1 million men died. The tanks did secure some local victories, but they could definitely have done better. So, how did they improve on that? Well, they improved upon this with the subsequent marks of Landship, that being Marks 2, 3, and 4. Marks 2 and 3 were pretty much the same as Mark 1, so they were relegated to training duties. All the Mark 1s were withdrawn from service and put into other things. And the Mark 4, well, that was armed with slightly shorter cannons, so it could fit in a street, and it had thicker armor. That was it. All the improvements. And really, that was all that was needed, because the Mark IV became the most mass-produced tank during the First World War. So hey, congratulations to the Mark IV, I guess. The Mark IV also became one of the two combatants in the first tank-on-tank engagement, that being a Mark IV versus a German A7V, or toaster tank, as I like to call it, because it just looks like a toaster. I mean, seriously, come on, look at that thing. Anyway, technically it was Mark III Mark IVs against an A7V, but two of the Mark IVs were female, so they couldn't actually damage the A7V, so they didn't even fire. But, oh well. I mean, they were there, and they did take some fire, but not a lot. Yeah. And then Lusitania sank, of course, and then the Americans were there, and then, oh look, war's over. Now, this next period of time is known as the interwar period. Now, the interwar period is about a 2-decade span between the First World War and the Second World War. Now, there are two main tank developments that happen inside the interwar period. The first one is not really well known. It's not really all that useful, and not much came of it, but there's a lot of discussion surrounding it, especially because there's a lot of misinformation about it. And it's something called the Christie suspension. Now, the Christie suspension was made by a guy named Christie. And, well, each individual road wheel had its own spring for the Christie suspension. And what it did was just make the tank go really, really fast. However, it was very expensive, very hard to maintain, and took up a lot of the interior space. Great Britain tried it. They didn't like it. The Soviet Union tried it, and they also didn't like it, but they put it on their T-34 and were kind of stuck with it. Now, the other great development at this time was something known as Blitzkrieg. Now, the creation of Blitzkrieg is commonly attributed to two German generals, that being Erwin Rommel and Heinz Guderian. Now, to be clear, these Nazis, yes, they were in fact Nazis, did not make Blitzkrieg. They merely named it. The person who actually made the concept of Blitzkrieg is a guy by the name of Percy Hobart. He was a British general, and in about the 1920s, he had an idea for it, and he organized a war game for it. Except he wasn't really all that well liked, so all the other British officers kind of rigged the game against him and made it look really, really bad. So Blitzkrieg was never really adopted for the British, and the Germans got a hold of it, they learned of it, and said, ooh, this could actually work. So they kind of stole it. And Percy Hobart was actually sent to Africa because they wanted him away from Britain, because they didn't really like him at all. But his story continues on in World War II, and since that's really it for the interwar, not a lot happened, back to war. So, let's finish up Percy Hobart's story real quick. So, General Hobart was put to Africa and told to train up this unit that had recently gotten tanks. Now, this unit was formerly Dragoons. Now, Dragoons is a form of mounted cavalry where the actual cavalrymen would charge into battle, they would break their spear or their lance or whatever, and then they would dismount and fight on foot. Now, the Dragoons decided it would be a good idea to use this same old tactic with their new mount. Obviously, this was no good, because what they would do was just leave their gunner and their loader in there to actually work the main gun and have everyone else jump out and fight as a regular infantryman. This removes the tank's ability to spot things, and removes the ability to take care of infantry effectively, and removes the ability to drive. So Hobart saw this, and put a stop to it, and he did wind up whipping them into shape, and by the time he was called back to Great Britain, and a new commander was put in place, this unit fought so tenaciously, so fearlessly against the German and Italian advance in Africa that they became known as the Desert Rats, the most effective armored fighting unit in Africa during World War II. And that was because of Hobart, and that's pretty cool. But his story does not end there. You see, the now Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, called him back because he wanted him to design specialized tanks. Now, these tanks became known as Hobart's Funnies. These included Sherman with flamethrower, known as a Crocodile, a Sherman with rocket artillery, known as a Calliope, a Sherman that had an identity crisis and wanted to go back to the Navy, called a Duplex Drive. And there was also a Sherman that was called a Crab. You'd expect it to go sideways, but it didn't. No, it went forward, but it had a big flail to beat mines into submission. So, overall, it did pretty good. And these tanks were super effective. The Crocodiles were used to great effect, actually, in the Pacific Theater against the Japanese. And overall, pretty good general. Now, I just wanted to finish up that story, so I'll get back to your regularly scheduled World War II. So, on the 1st of September, 1939, Germany invades the Free City of Danzig. Now, the Free City of Danzig was a territory between Poland and Germany. And they mostly considered themselves Polish, but technically they didn't have a country. Anyway, Germany wanted it, and they also wanted the rest of Poland, too. And then the Allies didn't really like that, and then the Germans took a month to take Poland with help, and then they turned around and took all of France in 6 weeks, and then Britain lost most of its army, and the rest of its army that was surviving was stuck in the British Isles, and they had to leave all of their equipment behind. They lost all of their tanks, they lost all of their equipment, they lost all of their anti-tank guns, all of their artillery, all of their infantry carriers, gone. Lost at Dunkirk. And that was really bad. And they had to start building up their stuff really quick. So the Navy and the Air Force actually got first pick on which factories to use. So the Navy could start building up their Navy again. The Air Force could start prepping for the aerial invasion of Britain by Germany. And then the Army was left with train factories. Now, the locomotive factories of Great Britain didn't know how to weld. They also couldn't cast armor, so they had to use riveted armor. As you may recall, riveted armor is the worst kind of armor. They did what they could. But overall, definitely could have gone better. So they make their tanks, they send them to Africa. They're alright. But they really start doing far better when America gets hit and then joins. And that is when the true war-winning tank appears. Now, to be clear, what I consider to be the actual war-winning tanks of the Second World War, I consider those to be the M4 Sherman and the T-34. Although the T-34 was a really bad tank overall, the only reason why it was good was because they had 80,000 of the things. But the M4 Sherman was great quality, great reliability, great pretty much everything. However, when America first joined the war, they didn't have any Shermans that they could actually field. And if they did, they were going to the Pacific Theater, not Africa, not to the Soviet Union. They needed a tank that could do that. So they built one. And they called it the medium tank M3 Lee. And yes, it was named after the Confederate General Lee from the Civil War. Not gonna lie, I did not expect the Americans to name a tank after a rebel, but to be fair, it looks fairly ugly, so I can see where they got that from. Now, the Lee did look like it was designed by a guy who was very drunk, but it got the job done. It had a medium velocity 75mm cannon in the hull and a 37mm cannon in the turret. And it was actually pretty good. There are numerous stories of a bunch of German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs rolling up to some town in the desert, start shelling it, and then an M3 Lee pops out and immediately takes out two of the German tanks, and then all the other German tanks turn around and run because they know that they can't take it out. So, yeah, it was a very good tank, at least for what it had to do. When the Germans started fielding up-gunned Panzer IVs and up-gunned Panzer IIIs and up-armored Panzer IIIs and all of that upgrades and a lot of up-gun stuff, it started to struggle. And then the British made a variant of it that they called the Grant. Grant being the Union general from the Civil War that fought Lee, which I find incalculably funny. And all they really did to it was just take out one of the crew members and instead make it so that the commander could operate the radio instead of having a separate guy do that job. But around mid to late 1942, the Shermans started coming into Africa, and then the Lees were eventually all taken back out of frontline service. And then the Sherman reigned supreme. Now, the M4 Sherman was a medium tank, named after the Union general from the Civil War, Sherman. Now, the M4 Sherman was the best tank of World War II, no doubt. It was the most reliable, it was the most comfortable, and it got the job done the best. And part of that was with its gun. Now, it was armed with a medium-velocity 75mm anti-tank gun, much like the one found on the M3 Lee. However, this one had access to a special smoke shell. You see, most smoke shells just create a curtain of smoke. That's it. However, this particular gun's smoke shell used white phosphorus, which has an incendiary effect. Meaning that this tank, aside from Crocodile variants being able to shoot actual napalm, could shoot what was the equivalent of a napalm shell at the enemy, making this one of the most effective anti-infantry weapons mounted on a tank during World War II. Now, of course, it's an American tank, so it's also covered in 50 cals and 30 cals and various other kinds of machine guns. And there was about 20 variants of the M4 Sherman made. Some of them, as mentioned earlier in Hobart's Funnies, could shoot flame, or swim, or be used as artillery. And others had a bigger gun on it. Some had extra armor that came in the form of another Sherman that was knocked out, and they just ripped all the armor off of it and shoved it onto another Sherman and called it the Sherman Jumbo. And yeah, that was it. It was in service throughout almost the entirety of World War II. It was in service for a couple decades after in some countries. And I believe there is like Panama or Paraguay or some Central or South American country that still has Shermans in its active armed services, which is utterly insane. I mean, it is nowhere near practical, but it just shows the longevity of the M4 Sherman. And now, here comes the other tank that people like to call the war winner of World War II, the T-34. Now, the T-34 was not a good tank. I'm just going to say, it was not a good tank. It had horrible reliability. It had an iffy gun at best, and its armor itself was just bad. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was designed great. They had a great designer. Although he did kind of catch pneumonia and die when he was trying to drive the thing for the first time, but the design was great. But they built 80,000 of the things in about 5 years, half of which were built in one factory. 40,000 tanks from one factory in about 5 years. Most of it done with slave labor. Now, do you think that's possible without cutting some corners? The correct answer is no, it's not possible. Now, I'm not going to go too into depth about that here because, quite simply, I do not have enough time for this. I know Laserpig made a hour-long video on the subject, the T-34, whatever it is. I don't know, I forget the name of the video. I'll probably post a picture of its thumbnail up on here somewhere. Go watch his video if you want to read more about that, but either way, T-34, bad tank overall. Now, I must also address the German tanks. Now, German tanks, on paper, were also pretty good, and it wasn't actually their build quality that led them to be so bad. It was just their over-engineering. You see, the Germans somehow managed to take a great design for a tank and then proceed to make it so that its transmission would absolutely turn itself into shrapnel the second a single particle of dust managed to get inside. Or, if you want to be slightly different, you could pick the Panther tank and have your internal combustion engine occasionally turn into an external combustion engine, because why not? So, yeah, overall, German tanks, horrible reliability. But don't get me wrong, they absolutely wrecked house when they actually made it to the battlefield. It was just an issue of getting them there. So, yeah. I mean, that's really it for World War II. Germans had Blitzkrieg. America had close air support and artillery and long-distance stuff, and the Russians used wave tactics. And the British really liked marching fire for some reason. That's really it for World War II. Yeah, Soviets took Berlin. America dropped a nuke or two. Now we're on to Cold War. Yippee! Space race. Vietnam. Berlin brinkmanship and all that fun stuff. So, let's get into that next. Now, after World War II, Great Britain came up with this brilliant idea for a new tank. This tank would combine the ideas behind the three main kinds of tanks from World War II. That of the light tank, the medium tank, and the heavy tank. And they came up with the Centurion. Now, the Centurion is classed as a main battle tank. The main battle tank has the speed of a light tank, the versatility and infantry support of a medium tank, and the armor and firepower from a heavy tank. Now, the main battle tank is great for many reasons. First of all, its versatility. And it's because of that versatility that it can fit out an entire army with just one kind of main battle tank. Whereas armies from World War II sometimes had upwards of 20 different kinds of tanks to outfit their army. This meant that World War II era armies had to not only crew all of those different kinds of tanks and train all that crew differently for all those different kinds of tanks, but also some of them used different kinds of fuel, some of them used different kinds of ammunition. So overall, just one main kind of tank just means that your supply line is just that much shorter. Now, there are two main design philosophies when it comes to main battle tanks. That being the Western design philosophy with the Leopard, the Challenger, and the Abrams, and the Eastern design philosophy with things like the ZTZ-99A, the T-72, and the T-90. Now, Western design philosophy is that of survivability. We'll take out 20, 30, 40 of your tanks before you take out one of ours. And they spare no expense when it comes to building these things. Some of them are upwards of 60 tons, and they have advanced fire control systems, thick armor, blowout ammo racks, reliable engines, very fast, and overall, a really good tank. Now, Eastern philosophy for tank design is based around guns. Now, I'm not saying, oh yeah, they have a much bigger gun on them, that's what makes them different. No, they're based around defending themselves against guns. They made themselves smaller, like a lot smaller than your average Abrams or Leopard. And this did make them very hard to hit with a gun. But nowadays, they have to face up against missiles and drones. And they can track things. They don't care how small you are. They're just gonna find you anyway. So overall, when they had to sacrifice, just wasn't good compared to what they have now. You lose a crew member, you lose a lot of armor, you lose reliability, all for just being a little bit smaller, and it just doesn't pan out in the modern day. Another really big development for the Cold War was that of aircraft. You see, the big armored conflicts that happened during World War II, the Battle of Arrancourt and the Battle of Kursk, were really only possible due to their either not having enough aircraft in the air, or the aircraft not even actually able to get airborne in the first place. You see, close air support has always been a major threat to tanks. Sure, yeah, a tank is always going to be able to try to kill another tank, but a bomb doesn't care about how much armor you have, it's just going to blow up the tank. So, aircraft struggled in fog and in night, so that's when tanks liked to come out and do their attacks and all that. But, in the Cold War, they came up with something known as all-weather capable ground attack fighters. Things like the F-4 Phantom. Now, the Phantom doesn't care if it's raining, or if it's night, or if it's really foggy. It's got a guided bomb, and it's going to find that tank. So, tanks started to struggle a lot against aircraft, and this was really seen during the Gulf War, where the fourth largest army, comprised of mostly T-72s for its armor, just got absolutely annihilated in a couple of weeks by overwhelming aerial superiority. So, aircraft do kind of dominate the modern-day battlefield. However, drones are starting to become a bit of an issue too. Specifically, small FPV drones that you can buy off Amazon. Now, there are a few things that countries are doing to try to get rid of this problem. I think America is trying to throw something on top of their Abrams. It's like just pretty much a big autocannon that they can load with airburst shells to take care of drones. There's something that the Russians are trying, which is like a jammer of some kind to block the connection between the drone and its pilot. And I want to say it's either Great Britain or France or like Germany or something like that's trying to use their active protection system, which is a system on the tank that's meant to shoot down missiles before it hits the tank. And they're trying to use that to also target drones. So, it'll be an interesting few years while we see what happens and how tanks try to adapt. But if they can't, well, then they'll probably be rendered obsolete, much like the cavalry that they replaced. And if they are rendered obsolete, I'm kind of excited to see what comes next after them. So, I mean, that's really it for the video, and considering I don't quite know how to end videos off quite yet, goodbye.